Secured inside could be the plans for an attack, an assassination, even a dirty bomb. Interrogation is the key to opening the lockbox and potentially saving hundreds of human lives.
You use any technique in your toolbox that you think will get this man to tell you what he knows.
From Nuremberg to Camp X-Ray, interrogators have honed the controversial techniques of their dark art.
If it means putting a 110 volt on him and flipping the switch, you've got to get that guy to talk.
People's lives depend on the information that you're extracting from potentially very bad people.
We pay for their silence in blood.
Washington, D.C., the near future. The CIA uncovers incomplete information suggesting a terrorist plot to detonate a radioactive dirty bomb somewhere in the western United States. Clandestine chatter indicates the attack will occur within the next 2 weeks. Meanwhile, in the Pakistani tribal region of Waziristan, CIA agents and U.S. Special Forces close in on a high-value target. One thought to have issued the attack command to a sleeper cell in the United States.
If I fail to get the information from him, many people may die. It pretty much leads you to the conclusion that you're morally obligated to get information from somebody if that information will save lives. That's the ticking bomb scenario.
You've got that guy, you've got an hour or a couple hours to work him. You've got to work him hard. You've got to take the gloves off. You've got to scare him to the maximum degree.
From the moment of arrest, it's a race against the clock to find out about the attack in time to stop it.
From the very earliest moments of his or her capture, they're going to try to disorient that person. They're going to try to extend or amplify sort of what the anxiety that that prisoner feels. Sometimes it's just goggles spray painted black. Sometimes it's burlap sacks just pulled over their head and cinched.
Put earmuffs on them or earplugs so they can't hear so well, and jerk them around.
And I want to get as many sensory things going on him as I can to keep him confused, keep him off balance.
Shackling them, spinning them in circles, making them dizzy, moving them from place to place so that they no longer have a clear idea of who they're with or where they are.
And make him feel that he is in a foreign atmosphere. He might as well be on Mars.
The bewildered prisoner is secretly transferred to an undisclosed location.
They may be being held on Diego Garcia, an island that the United States military uses. They may be on an aircraft carrier somewhere, deep in the bowels of one of these floating cities. I'm sure they don't know where they are exactly, and that's the point.
The holding facility is designed to manipulate the prisoner's deepest fears.
You can alter the environment so that they think they're in a place that's very dangerous to them when in fact maybe they're not.
False flags making a prisoner believe that he's not in U.S. custody.
You could, for instance, pretend that you've flown them to, say, Saudi Arabia, where they know that they could be tortured and executed, when in fact you've just flown them to an island and made it look like it's Saudi Arabia.
The prisoner is stripped of his possessions in a process devised to also strip him of his dignity.
Everything that's found in their possession is bagged and tagged, letters, photos, other items found in their pockets. They're fingerprinted and photographed. Then they undergo a medical examination. They're stripped, and they have doctors opening their mouths and prying around with tongue depressors. And they're put in their prison jumpsuits, and that's what they're going to be wearing for the remainder of their time in custody.
Now the prisoner is prepared for questioning.
I want him psychologically off balance, emotionally off balance. I don't want him to be happy. I don't want to feed him. I don't want to give him water.
The simplest thing that you can do to disorient someone is to keep them from falling asleep.
Sleep deprivation, temperature changes.
Human beings thrive on routines and patterns. And so it's important not to allow any kind of pattern to develop with a suspect.
Every touchstone he has in his life, you disrupt.
The most effective way of putting pressure on somebody is to reduce them to the point where they are a seething collection of simple human needs: warmth, comfort, food, light, quiet, sleep. And if you can reduce a person to the point where They rely upon you for these most basic things. You can then manipulate them to get the information that they have.
This is no game. He's mine, and I'm the sole master of what his life and future is.
Now, the interrogation begins.
They're taken to a booth, the interrogation booth, but they're very, very sparse, and they're designed to be that way. You don't have anything in them except a couple of chairs and a table. There's no phone, there's no maps, there's nothing. It's just blank space.
The prisoners kept physically off balance during questioning.
Found in an uncomfortable position for long periods of time, not being allowed to use a bathroom.
With a high-level prisoner, the interrogator can't afford to take a leisurely approach.
You know this guy knows guys. You know that he knows about operations. You need to get him to talk as quickly as possible to trace along the daisy chain and get other people in the line.
And a person like that would be subject to the most aggressive interrogation techniques that are allowed by the U.S. government.
The most important thing is fear. If the person you arrest has no fear that anything bad is going to happen to them or anything bad is going to happen to their loved ones, they're going to probably tolerate whatever kind of questioning you give them.
The interrogator paints an unflattering picture of the prisoner's future, and then suggests the only way he might avoid that ugly fate.
Give them the impression that you try to help them, to show them a way out, to let them blame somebody else. I want him to think that other people of the cell have been captured. I want him to think that somebody up the cell structure is the person that gave me the information that allowed me to capture him. People like to blame other people for their own mistakes, naturally. Let them blame somebody else.
There is a phrase in Arabic, let 100 mothers cry, but not my mother. But if my mother cries, better my mother than me.
Once the prisoner begins talking, the interrogator must be able to verify the truth.
You have to have people who are following up on all of the information that he provides so that you know fairly quickly whether he's lying to you or telling you the truth. What could be more powerful or effective for an interrogator that in the same session with someone, let's say 45 minutes after that person has given you a piece of information, to be able to say to them, you lied to us. We know that that's a lie. You have tremendous power to check up on what he's saying or not saying, and that it will do him no good to try to lead you down a false path.
Any piece of information extracted by the interrogator can be critical.
When you're questioning someone who has important intelligence, it has a shelf life. The value of what they're telling you is only there for a short period of time. The faster that you can follow up on what they tell you, hit the houses where their associates are living, round up the people who are working with them, that's the best way to use that information.
The battle of wills that plays out in the interrogation room is for the highest possible stakes.
And the cost could be people's lives.
I'm down to hours or maybe minutes to get the kind of information that I need to preclude that attack. I don't have time to talk to lawyers. I don't have time to wait for the White House or the Attorney General to make a decision.
Well, I'm going to get that information if all possible because I want to save American lives. And I don't care what anybody says. My American lives are more important to me than my prisoner's life.
You are watching The Dark Art of Interrogation on the History Channel. Somewhere in an undisclosed location, interrogators ply their controversial dark art against the enemies of America. March 2002. Osama bin Laden's alleged field commander Abu Zubaydah captured in Pakistan. September 2002. Alleged al-Qaeda leader Ramzi bin al-Shibh captured in Pakistan. March 2003. It's revealed that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, is in U.S. custody. The timing and events of his capture remain wrapped in secrecy.
It's important when you arrest someone like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed not to let the world know you have. As soon as the people who work with him know that he's in custody, they're going to begin to scatter. They're going to begin to change their method of operation, change whatever kinds of codes that they use for one another.
You pick up somebody like KSM. The first concern is, do you think he does have information about something that's about to occur?
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would know who are the key figures in his organization. Where might you look to find them? And the other thing that's really critical is, how do they continue to function? Where do they get money? What are their methods of communication?
Once somebody like KSM's picked up, you can count on the fact that there's a lot of movement taking place. They're shutting down safe houses, they're closing accounts, they're shutting down cell phones. They're doing a variety of things to essentially try to wipe the tracks so that they can't be found in the event that he does start cooperating.
So it's critical that they not know that that person is in custody for as long as you can, maintain that blackout of information.
Few know exactly where America's captured high-value targets are being held, and just who is interrogating them.
People responsible for the impending interrogation. That could be individuals from the agency, could be individuals from the military intelligence, Defense Department.
Our own United States interrogators are operating under well-defined rules, but sometimes we need to go to get that extra mile to get information. We're letting the Saudis, the Jordanians, some other people do interrogations of these guys. We're taking some of these high-level prisoners, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Abu Zubaydah, and others who we know are coming out of the top structure of the Al-Qaeda network, and handing them over to other agencies or intelligence services for interrogation.
Somewhere in a dark, desolate place, America is fighting a battle of will and wits in the war on terror.
They're probably going outside the bounds a little bit. Human rights activists aren't going to like it.
Racing against the clock for information. Intelligence agencies have long experimented with controversial shortcuts to penetrating the mind of the enemy.
The CIA and intelligence agencies all over the world have long sought a kind of magic pill that would make somebody spill their guts. There have been a number of different drugs that have been filled with possibility over the years: LSD, sodium pentothal. Sensory deprivation as part of a carefully constructed coercive interrogation can be very effective. But in the end, there's no magic pill that you can give somebody that will make them spill their darkest secrets or betray their best friends.
Interrogation remains more of an art than a science. The development of techniques to probe today's enemies can be traced back to World War II and beyond. November 20th, 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. The world begins to explore the mind of the most ruthless enemy the modern world has ever seen.
I think there are some very similar issues with the problems in the current war against terror.
Richard Overy's The Interrogations recounts the Allied interrogations of Nazi war criminals in preparation for the Nuremberg trials.
Evidence was very important, because without evidence it would be impossible to charge and convict the senior war criminals, just to make sure that these cases would actually stick. And in one really big case, the Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews, there was really a desperate shortage of material.
June 1945. Allies begin rounding up the Nazi elite who have scattered with the fall of the Third Reich. Like the terror war, the Allied powers must decide how to classify and process the captured.
There were lots of arguments about the nature of the trial. In the end, it was decided that American interrogators would be used for the major war criminals who were going to be arraigned at Nuremberg. They just needed to know more about how the Third Reich worked, who gave orders to whom, who was responsible for which particular element of what they regarded as a criminal regime. The second thing they wanted, of course, was for people simply to incriminate themselves, to confess.
August 1945. A team led by Colonel John Amon begins to interrogate the Nazi captives.
A typical interrogation at Nuremberg would have been conducted in a small interrogation room. There would be a table, 3 or 4 chairs, there would be an interpreter, a stenographer, and then the interrogator would start asking the questions. Interrogations were slow, and they generally lasted about 2 to 3 hours.
As in the War on Terror, those interrogating the Nazis have begun delving into uncharted territory.
Interrogating was for many people a difficult thing to do. They had very little experience of it. All the interrogators realized that the people they were going to interrogate were not going to simply sit down in a chair and say to them, yes, I did it all. None of them was going to say, yes, we slaughtered the Jews and we agreed to do it. There were going to be various ways, strategies of denial, we might call them. Some of them were extreme. Some people committed suicide because they were desperate not to be indicted for the thing they knew lay behind these questions.
Everyone is different. Some people are vain, some people are cowards, some people are gluttons, some people are more worried about their families than themselves. If you know what is most important to the person you're questioning, you're in a position to apply the leverage that works.
There was one interrogator, Kenneth Heckler, who, when he had to do his very first interrogation, got himself all psychologically prepared. He was going to be tough on these people. And the first person he had to interrogate was a high-ranking soldier from Hitler's headquarters, Walter Warlimont. Warlimont came in, a career soldier, something of a gentleman. Heckler didn't know what to do. In the end, he simply stood there. Warlimont put out his hand. Heckler shook it. Within a few minutes, they were smoking cigarettes.
You are watching The Dark Art of Interrogation on the History Channel. Through the Nazi horrors of World War II, America could claim the moral high ground when it came to interrogation practices and treatment of prisoners of war. Just decades later, the onset of a bloody guerrilla war in Vietnam would bring about a reassessment of principles.
There appear to be strict rules, but they are somewhat open to interpretation. But the trouble is, you sometimes lose your perspective after a long time in the field and a long time fighting the enemy.
One of the most interesting scenarios that I think would pose a problem for just about anyone who's theoretically opposed to the use of torture is the battlefield problem.
While there may be one set of rules for interrogations that take place in a dark room, the realities of war lead some American officers to question how far they should go to protect their men.
Bill Cowan, who was an officer in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, faced precisely such a challenge.
I was working with what we call PRU, Provisional Reconnaissance Units, and I would add that all of these units we conducted were out in the field, in the bushes, in the jungles, and in the paddies. The local Viet Cong would hide out around the countryside in the daytime and mass at night for attacks. So during the daytime, the idea was to find out where these guys were hiding.
He and his men were being ambushed repeatedly by Viet Cong, who would hide out in the swampy area that they were tasked to patrol.
1969. Tired of seeing his men picked off by these ambushes, Cowan knows he must make the most out of his opportunity when the unit flushes out a Viet Cong officer.
We captured a squad leader with his AK-47.
A member of this Viet Cong organization who would have information about where these ambushes were being planned, where his people were hidden.
Now, Cowan faces a dilemma.
He could either treat this person humanely, following all the rules of war, and then subject his men to further ambushes and attacks, or he could bring whatever pressure he could bring to bear on this person to get information that saved the lives of his men. And I'm telling you now that the humane side of that equation loses out all the time.
In his interrogation with the captured Viet Cong leader, Cowan veers into the moral gray area between lawful interrogation techniques and outright torture.
Never once would we harm somebody physically to the point that it left marks, that it broke bones, that it did anything of a long-term nature. It's not so much that you do something to them, it's that you strike the absolute fear of God into them that something terrible is going to happen. When we captured people in Vietnam, we would try to scare them with this prospect of electricity. Now, we can take a small generator off a handset telephone, and you crank it 1 or 2 times, and it really make them jump. And when you have the idea that a lot more of that's going to be applied to you, you start thinking about, well, maybe I'd rather talk.
Though Cowan's tactics may be questionable, the results are not.
The next day, he took us back out to another location about 1.5 miles from where he was, and we captured his platoon commander. Took us right to the guy. We brought the platoon commander back in. We did the same kind of interrogation. The next day, the platoon commander took us directly to the company commander. So we had 3 guys wrapped up for 3 days.
Battlefield interrogations can provide information crucial for successful combat operations. When the information is ignored, the there can be consequences.
In 1967, I was a platoon commander in a Marine battalion up along the DMZ, and we were in a hellacious fight, 55 Marines killed, in a long battle with a numerically superior force.
Early in the fighting, American forces captured 2 enemy soldiers.
There were 2 North Vietnamese prisoners taken the first day of that battle. One of those prisoners was killed. Throat was slit by one of the officers who had taken him prisoner. He wanted to do that to show the other prisoner that we were going to do the same to him if he didn't talk.
The extreme tactic is effective.
The other prisoner was trying to talk. He was trying to tell us about where their headquarters was, and he kept giving us the name. I spoke Vietnamese reasonably well. I interrogated the guy. What he was telling us did not correspond to anything we could find on the map. So higher headquarters said, you know, the guy's lying, let's not worry about it, let's keep moving.
The fight continues.
2 days later, while this battle was still going on, we took some documents off a dead NBA, and their map showed exactly what the prisoner had been talking about. And indeed, he had been telling us the truth. I've reflected many times on the thought that if maybe the people in the back would have taken another hard look at it, and the operation would have been conducted differently, and we wouldn't have lost as many Marines.
You wonder, did I do my job? Did I exercise every possible and every available option in order to pursue the information that might otherwise have saved the lives of the fighting troops that we're supposed to be supporting?
You can begin to understand the moral dilemma of not using whatever means are available to prevent such things from happening.
Further compounding the moral dilemma are the interrogation practices employed by America's enemies. Nothing the Americans did hasn't also been done to U.S. prisoners of war. You are watching The Dark Art of Interrogation on the History Channel. Though defined by chaos, every war has rules. International law puts restrictions on the interrogation of high-level al-Qaeda figures like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. But with the clock ticking and innocent lives potentially at stake, the U.S. argues that the rules may no longer apply.
If the United States regards the captives at Camp X-Ray or, say, top al-Qaeda arrestees like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as prisoners of war, we are then obligated as a country to follow the rules of the Geneva Convention, which spells out in great detail what you can and what you can't do with someone in custody. Clearly, under the terms of the Geneva Convention, you cannot apply any kind of coercive techniques in questioning someone to get information. So, if we label these captives prisoners of war, we are essentially tying our hands by adopting a code that was written for an era of warfare that ended many years ago.
Instead, U.S. officials classify captives like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as enemy combatants.
Refusing to categorize someone who's been arrested as a prisoner of war leaves a certain amount of leeway in the way people can be treated. And I think that it is the better part of wisdom to preserve the ability to maneuver with these people, precisely because it is so critically important to be able to get information.
Denying suspected terrorists the protections of the Geneva Convention has been controversial. But the U.S. is not the first country to skirt international guidelines on interrogation. In Vietnam, America's own soldiers would be brutalized by an enemy with no pretense of playing by the rules.
It was the communists that changed the rules of the game on prisoners of war from anything that anybody had done before.
If you refuse the answer, they said you cannot refuse the answer, you're a criminal, not a prisoner of war. And they made it very clear we had no rights under the Geneva Convention and that they could do anything they wanted with us.
Torture, death, and maybe worse.
Jerry Singleton and Ken Cordier are veterans of the Vietnam War. Air Force pilots downed far behind enemy lines during the height of the fighting.
I was flying missions over North Vietnam, and on the day I got shot down, I was flying an escort mission protecting a B-66 electronic reconnaissance bomber and took a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile. I was a typical young fighter pilot, thought I was master of the universe, and went from that state of mind to hanging helpless in a parachute a few seconds later and captured immediately upon hitting the ground.
Late 1965. Jerry Singleton's CH-53 helicopter is shot out of the sky while flying a rescue mission over North Vietnam.
They were ready for us. We got hit by a 37mm anti-aircraft fire, caught fire instantly, and the entire crew bailed out.
Without food or water, Singleton eludes capture for 5 days. Finally, his luck runs out. Following their capture, Singleton and Cordier are taken to the same place.
They blindfolded us, tied us up in the back of a truck, and took us off. We could hear the sounds of the city as we got into Hanoi.
A U.S. soldier was taken to a place called Hilton Hotel.
The Hanoi Hilton. The Vietnamese called it the Wallow prison. It had been built by the French for the French to house the Vietnamese prisoners while they were colonialists in Southeast Asia.
The Hanoi Hilton would be Singleton and Cordier's home for the remainder of the war.
They would put me in a small cell in a 5-cell block that we called the Heartbreak Hotel.
The cells in Heartbreak Hotel were about 5.5 feet wide and 8 feet long. There was a walkway down the center with a cement slab bunk on each side. The windows had bars on them.
We lived in a cell with boards to sleep on. We never had any pads or mattress or anything. The walls were whitewashed. There was a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and that was on 24/7. They had bricked out the windows so we couldn't see out. It was forbidden to ever look at another prisoner. There was a loudspeaker box on the ceiling for our daily ration of propaganda, and a rusty bucket in the corner for the toilet, which we were allowed out once a day to empty. 3 years and 8 months I lived there, and we had some of our very worst times in that camp.
Stripped of all physical comforts, the POWs are now subjected to the mental rigors of interrogation.
We used to participate directly in interrogating American soldiers.
They had some English-speaking interrogators that were pretty much with us the whole experience. And these guys had free rein to use any physical punishment or torture.
Though all Air Force pilots are trained to endure questioning, it's difficult to prepare for the real thing.
There is no training in the world that will make being a prisoner of war easy or even tolerable. But it sure is an advantage if you have some idea what to expect.
All combat crews were required to go through the combat survival school, and in that they showed us various interrogation techniques and how we could counter that. I went through the school in 1964, and 2 years later I was doing it for real.
At first, the Vietnamese interrogators are after information they can exploit on the battlefield. Actionable intelligence.
For most of the guys, the first questions were about military matters. What kind of aircraft were you flying? What were its dimensions, capabilities? What are the targets? What are the disposition of U.S. forces? What's the U.S. strategic plan?
The Americans have been trained to give one answer to an interrogator's line of questioning.
They asked me some questions. I gave name, rank, service number, and date of birth.
Instructing soldiers to provide only their name, rank, and serial number was very ineffective and unrealistic. Almost no one in captivity, threatened with torture, threatened with death, is going to hold to such a stark position. In real life, what people do is they try to differentiate between information that is vital and information that really doesn't make that much difference if you tell people.
I thought, well, if I'm just making up stories, telling lies, they'll catch me up because my mind is so scrambled at the moment I won't be able to keep things straight. So I decided I would just answer the truth and multiply everything by 3. Capabilities of the aircraft and so forth. And I thought they'd come back at me again for more lies, but they didn't. They accepted it.
As the war drags on, the Vietnamese become less willing to tolerate the American POWs' attempts at misdirection. Their treatment takes a drastic turn for the worse.
We were going through a transition.
In the interrogation room, the tactics and questioning become more aggressive.
Over time, as they had the opportunity to do more and more torture and hurt. Most of what I encountered was being stood on my knees and hold hands up in the air, get a rifle butt in the back or back of the head, you know, until you just, there's nothing left.
No, I went through several torture sessions there where they put your hands in manacles behind you and tied ropes around your upper arms and cinched up on it until the elbows touched.
And then they just start bending things in ways that they weren't intended to go. And I went through that a few times, you know, as long as I could.
1966. The goal of interrogations at the Hanoi Hilton has shifted dramatically.
By mid-66, the Communist Party of North Vietnam had come up with the brilliant idea of war crimes tribunals for us. They were working up to a plan to indict us formally and try us, each one as war criminals, and then execute us.
Everybody was tortured till they broke and signed a war crimes confession.
To extract the war crimes confessions, the Vietnamese abandoned interrogation tactics in favor of outright brutality.
They decided they needed to put more pressure on me. I was still pretty brave at this time, and I said, "This is barbaric. You're torturing me, and I need to see a doctor." And he said, "Oh, what's the problem?" And I said, "I think my back is broken. I need to see a doctor. I'm in a lot of pain." And then he jabbered something in Vietnamese, and when they put me in the ropes this time, they hogtied me, put a rope around my neck and my ankles, and pulled up until my back was arched.
Contrary to what you see in the movie, pain usually does not cause you to pass out. Pain is an extremely powerful stimulant. It will keep you awake when nothing else will, even if you've been going through this for several days. Your body just reaches the point where it says, "I can't take the pain anymore. I've got to do something to change it." And it makes no difference how strong your emotional courage, your spiritual courage, or your intellectual courage is, the body will take over.
Eventually, all of the American POWs cave in.
Virtually every one of our prisoners will tell you that in the final analysis, they confess to something because of the pain.
I'll write anything you want when the pain gets to be enough.
It was just a bitter pill to condemn your government and say all these things in a war crimes confession. That was really hard to deal with. Here you are, this proud fighter pilot signing a war crimes confession. It was just a tremendous change of state.
He's brought back into his cell. He's dumped on the floor. He's in absolute tears because he feels ashamed because he's betrayed his country. He is absolutely at the bottom, physically and emotionally. The guy next door says, "You're not the Lone Ranger. You aren't the first one. You won't be the last one. You did the best you could. Thank you very much for it. Build your strength back up because it'll happen again."
Torture tactics at the Hanoi Hilton continue their evolution until the end of the war.
The death threat was always there.
There's any number of guys that were taken out blindfolded, made to kneel down, and then they would pop a camera flashbulb next to them or cock a gun and shoot it, tell the guy they were going to be executed, and then have these mock executions.
One of the effects that we saw was kind of like the wild animal that gets a taste for blood. They liked it. Some of the folks that they had working on us were absolute psychos.
I hated my long-term interrogator. I really hated him. I used to go back to my cell and fantasize all the ways I could kill him. We had faith that we would eventually be free and that our government would not abandon us.
Now, several guys didn't make it through, and several guys paid just an unimaginable price. But all of us that got to come home were able to return with honor.
Portier and Singleton returned to America with honor in February 1973. Their country would learn a lot from its Vietnam POWs about interrogation, torture, and the difference between the two.
Torture, in my judgment, is just brutalizing people for whatever purposes, whether it's to extract a confession which is not real or whether it's to get the information of a minor nature. It's just man's inhumanity to man. That's what torture is. Clearly, over the long time, Pain makes people talk. Whether they're telling you the truth or not, it's always hard to judge.
In the case of a high-value al-Qaeda target, an interrogator can't afford to solicit false information. The true facts have the potential to save lives. You are watching The Dark Art of Interrogation on the History Channel. In the 1970s, in the wake of the Vietnam War, America would seem to lack the stomach for the darker side of intelligence gathering. But in the decade that follows, the ethical question of how far to go in an interrogation is complicated by the emergence of a new enemy tactic: terror. September 1982. Beirut, Lebanon is in the throes of war. Armed factions roam the streets while Israeli forces move in to drive out Yasser Arafat and his PLO guerrillas.
And then the Israel invaded in 1982, invaded the whole of Lebanon, and the United States interfered to rescue Arafat.
President Reagan sends more than 1,500 Marines to help restore order in Beirut.
Ronald Reagan dispatched a multinational force to try to end the civil war, and they arranged an evacuation of Arafat and his guerrillas by sea.
America would soon pay the price for its efforts in Beirut.
These people had studied the embassy structure, and they drove up with this pickup that was rigged with about 500 kilograms of high-powered explosives.
I was with Special Envoy Ambassador Philippe Habib at the Presidential Palace when we heard the noise.
I remember we had a visitor that I escorted to the lobby. And after that, I went in the elevator and I was talking to my boss.
I was talking over the phone. The person I was talking to died instantly.
You'll love to see it. There were bodies dangling from windows. About 80% of the huge structure was totally pulverized.
It looked like you would have a piece of cake and you came and you sliced it. The whole building. Terrible. We lost colleagues, we lost people.
It was something not to forget at all. I was lucky to survive. We lost so many good colleagues.
63 are killed, including 17 Americans. Virtually the entire CIA Middle East station is wiped out. Desperate to find out who was behind the blast, the CIA calls on a covert operative known as Captain Crunch, Keith Hall.
Keith Hall was a CIA agent who was given the assignment of going to Beirut to try to figure out who bombed the United States Embassy.
Well, my mission in Beirut, as explained to me, was very clear. I was to find out who blew up the U.S. Embassy. The president himself was going to be reading my cable traffic, and this information was being gathered for a counterstrike.
It was one of the first times American intelligence agency was trying to unravel the roots of a terrorist plot. Hall went over to Beirut, he believed, with the authority to do whatever he needed to do to figure out who was responsible for this. Keith Hall was working as a free agent, was living on rooftops and basically being as deep undercover as a person could be. And the way that he worked primarily was to cooperate with the local intelligence officials who were trying to figure out how this happened.
The existing authorities, official authorities at the time, had no real authority. The militias were calling the shots.
Dangerous, very dangerous. I mean, you never know what's going to happen next in Beirut. We had the Israelis still blowing up the place. But it is a game, and the game is, if you lose, it can be your life.
As his Lebanese counterparts round up suspects, Hall goes to work on them.
He would bring pressure to bear on the suspects who they arrested and use the fact that the United States was willing to do anything to find out what happened to frighten the people being interrogated.
Hall's interrogations lead to a man he suspects as the paymaster of the operation, Elias Nimmer. Nimmer is a high-ranking member of the Christian militia known as the Phalange. He is considered untouchable.
He was a very smug young individual, and I started breaking him down with no food, no water, sleep deprivation, temperature changes. I would put heaters in there and try and keep him real hot, uncomfortable. And other times, would hose him down and just let him be real cold. And these are all acceptable techniques. I mean, the agency has taught these for years.
Hall is believed to have used techniques outlined in the CIA's Kubark Manual.
The Kubark Manual is the CIA's basic instruction manual on methods of interrogation. And it was prepared during the 1950s, and it outlines in great detail methods for interrogating prisoners, for everything from scams that interrogators can use to trick information out of people, to play acting that an interrogator can use, to more coercive methods.
Was some physical coercion used? Yes, it was. I kicked him out of a chair once. I punched him once to wipe that smirk off his face, and I know this was very serious. This is no game. The cavalry's not coming in that door to jerk him out.
He went beyond merely frightening these prisoners with threats. He actually began whacking people with bats on their legs and physically torturing people.
Hall finally gets his confession.
Nimmer broke after, several weeks of no food, no water, sleep deprivation, and temperature changes, and throwing him out of a chair a few times, and punching him a couple times, letting him know that he's not a protected boy anymore.
Hall believes the confession will lead to the mastermind of the embassy bombing.
I don't think we can know whether the information that Keith Hall got was accurate or not, because one of the things that we do know is that when you begin physically torturing people, they will tell you whatever they need to tell you to make you stop.
When a man simply tells you that, yes, he did something, there are people that will say, well, he did that to avoid further pain. Well, in some cases, that very well might be true. But in this case, we weren't doing that to these people. We just simply wore him out.
A serious interrogation doesn't just involve asking questions and making threats or using coercive techniques. It needs to be done in tandem with a very serious investigative follow-up, so that you know whether the person you're questioning is providing you with accurate information or is merely telling you whatever you want to hear.
So you always want to be able to corroborate, but you can't always do that. Maybe down the road you can, but in the time frame of when you need this information, is it valid, can I use it, you may not have that corroboration. You just got to go on the fact that we think he's telling the truth.
Hall returns to Langley with a taped confession, expecting to be congratulated. Instead, he gets a chilly reception.
Instead of being celebrated as a hero, he found himself caught up in a condemnation of the techniques used to obtain this information. What Keith Hall didn't appreciate sufficiently was that any kind of military or intelligence operation takes place in a political context. And so he was heading off to Beirut basically to take the gloves off, to do whatever he needed to do to get information at a time when that was politically unpalatable in the United States.
I'm the poster child in the intelligence community for if you want to really screw up your career, try and do the job.
After Hall's return to Washington, it is learned that Elias Nimmer has died under mysterious circumstances in his cell.
And this led to a scandal which had the effect of pulling the plug on the CIA investigation into what happened, and also had the effect of destroying Keith Hall's career with the CIA.
My job was to go out there and get hardcore intel for a counterstrike, not to bring people to trial. And that's what I did.
My opinion is that Keith Hall was an overeager cowboy of an interrogator, and you don't conduct investigations into terrorist cells by sending a maverick CIA agent over to beat people with a baseball bat.
I wasn't told to go out there and arrest people and read them their rights. I was told to get information. Let the FBI play with that silly game. They're a law enforcement agency. I'm a spook, or was a spook.
The bombers of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut have never been punished.
Every day there's something that reminds me of it, every day. I haven't talked about it since 20 years ago. I don't think justice was done, no?
6 months after the embassy bombing, another terrorist bomb decimates the U.S. Marine barracks, killing 241 American servicemen. Less than 4 months later, President Reagan withdraws U.S. troops from Lebanon. Osama bin Laden would later cite this move as an indication of America's lack of resolve.
I think since 9/11, there's been a lot of pressure on our intelligence industry and the military to do whatever needs to be done to get information, because all of us do feel the urgency. So the methods that Keith Hall employed 20 years ago might be more acceptable today.
It's a very dark art, and it's a dirty art. You cannot be in the intelligence game and in the interrogation game and ride a white horse.
Many argue that fighting fire with fire is the only way to slow down the evolution of terror. Unchecked, the tactics developed in Beirut would soon come to the heart of Israel. As civilian casualties mount, Israel will have to decide how far they're willing to go to stop the carnage. The fight against modern terror straddles a boundary between warfare and law enforcement. In the near future, American interrogators may be pressed to uncover plans to an impending attack. Those whose mission is to unlock the secrets of the enemy can look to the ones who wrote the book on interrogation. No one can get to the truth quite like a New York cop.
I tend to have an attitude that everybody lies to me. Maybe it's being brought up in New York, where everybody does lie to you.
Joseph King is a 33-year veteran special agent for U.S. Customs and Homeland Security.
In the United States, a law enforcement situation, whether it's a terrorist situation or whether it's a bank robbery, we have very strict guidelines about what you can do and can't do.
In police interrogation, the goal is to convict somebody. Generally, the person they're interrogating has been involved in a crime, and they're trying to get information that they can use to build a case against them to be used in court. And of course, there are, in our system, a lot of legal restraints on the way that you can get information from people. Any information that was obtained through overt coercion would be thrown out of a court. It would violate due process.
You have responsibilities under the law that you're to be in compliance with the law, to protect the rights of the accused.
Police interrogators, because they work under such constraints, have become extremely artful at eliciting information from people.
In the United States, if you're aware of the consequences, you know brute force is really out of the question. Has it happened? Sure, I'm sure it has. Are there allegations about mind games? Have you lied to him? Have you purposely misled him? Have you told him there's an eyewitness when there's no eyewitness? Yeah. Is it legal to mislead him? Yes. Did you Mirandize him? Did you give him all of his warnings? Did you allow him access to an attorney? Did you have him sign a declaration of his Miranda rights? Yes. Did you then go into some little good cop, bad cop? Did you lie to him? Yeah. Lying is a good method. Used it a lot. Good cop, bad cop, it's a good method. Used it a lot. Giving them an out. You're looking at 20 years federal time, but if you cooperate, we know you weren't the mastermind. Tommy was the mastermind. Act friendly. Not saying you have to be their best friend, but as far as cuffing them to the chair, smacking them around, doesn't get you much. After 5 or 10 years of interrogations, you can have your own system, you can have your own method. I'm going to tell them we have 3 eyewitnesses, even though we don't.
At heart, everybody really wants to tell their story. Even if the story is very damaging to them, they want to tell it.
My old partner used to use the absent-minded professor a lot. Good method. Which coffee shop did you go to? Did you go to the coffee shop on 5th Street? Or I thought you said 6th Street. Did I ask you about last Wednesday? Did you tell me about last Wednesday? No, it was Thursday. Oh, it was Thursday? Was that what I asked you? Thursday? What did I ask you about Thursday? Did I ask you about the heroin ring, or did I ask you about the money delivery? No, it was the money delivery. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. It was the money delivery. I keep getting that confused. That's the kind of absent-minded professor type of question where it almost seems like you're not concentrating on the issues. Wait a minute, did you just say that it was a Chevy? No, I said it was a Cadillac. I told you that 3 times. I'm sorry. It's a Cadillac. That's right, it was a Cadillac. Was it the blue Cadillac? Yeah, oh, okay. I've seen it in the past where people get annoyed at you and will tell you more than you want to know, because they're getting annoyed. Aren't you listening to me? I told you 3 times it was a damn blue Cadillac. What's the matter with you? My old partner used to say, don't pay any attention to him. He's a little older than me. He has, you know, he's got a little Alzheimer. He goes a little stenard. Don't worry about him. He gets like that.
While police interrogators usually have the luxury of time, intelligence and counter-terror interrogators may be pressed to get the information much faster.
I think Israel's experience and the United States' experience with threatened acts of just horrible atrocities and terror, you can begin to understand the moral dilemma of not using whatever means are available to prevent such things from happening.
Israel has more experience fighting terrorism than any other nation on earth. Over decades of Palestinian uprisings, Michael Kobe has earned his reputation as a master of interrogation.
Michael Kobe is one of the veteran interrogators for Shabak, which is the intelligence service of the Israeli army. And over many years in uprisings in the West Bank and Gaza, he supervised the interrogation of thousands of Palestinians. And in the area of interrogating terrorists and trying to gather information to prevent acts of terror, Kobe probably has more hands-on experience than anyone in the world.
They keep secrets. They keep secrets. כמובן.
But using wisdom and intelligence, you can get very good results without using force.
I think Michael Kobe is so good because he has a very strong appreciation for human nature. He knows what buttons to push to get this person to talk.
Most of the prisoners smoke, and in this case, I usually offer a cigarette. I loosen his handcuffs a bit, and I let them understand the difference between the 2 different atmospheres. There's the harsh atmosphere, and then the more pleasant.
One of the most effective things that he does is the use of theater. He would have a group of hooded men in a hallway.
I'm asking who wants to cooperate with me.
Of course, none of the prisoners can see with the hood on their heads what's going on.
There's only 1 or 2. Let's say 8. Okay, all those 8 must wait because I'm very busy now.
Well, which starts the other ones thinking, why am I sitting here, you know, risking my hide and all this difficulty when everybody else is cooperating?
There are so many people that are going to confess with such a punchline. I have to ask more investigators to come and work that night.
In addition to his use of theater, Kobe possesses a skill said to be lacking among American interrogators in the region.
Michael Kobe is a master of language. If you're an Israeli and you speak Hebrew and you're trying to question a Palestinian who speaks fluent Arabic, he has ways of hiding from you.
And there are so many idioms in Arabic, many.
Even if you speak Arabic, do you speak the correct dialects? It doesn't serve you to be in a situation where someone can say yes or no to all your questions. The more they speak, the more likely you are to get some usable intelligence out of it.
I personally know 300 idioms.
And that gives them a tremendous advantage in dealing with them because it eliminates the natural barrier that language sets up between 2 different peoples.
But many Palestinians allege that Israeli interrogators go much further than word games.
Hit me, scream at me, swear at me, humiliate me. They told me that we want to make sex, sleep with your mom, your sister. They think that because they are occupation, they have the right to humiliate people, to torture them.
Amnesty International once said torture is the one violation that every state will deny and no state will acknowledge. Israel for years was the exception to that.
There was a certain period when you were allowed to use physical pressure, only after getting permit from the higher positions.
There had to be a way to deal with what they called the ticking bomb, a suspect who knows about an imminent attack that's about to take place, and it's vital to get that information.
1987, Israel. The threat of terror from the first Palestinian Intifada leads to what many regard as the legalization of torture.
It happened in Israel when the Supreme Court tried to prescribe certain situations where the use of relatively mild coercive techniques was permissible.
The Landau regulations recommended the use of what they called moderate physical pressure in exceptional cases, these ticking bomb cases.
For certain investigations, we got special permits to use physical pressure. This was very restrained force.
Now, what they meant by moderate physical pressure was included in a secret annex to the Landau report.
A curtain sack on my head, handcuffed, cuffed in legs.
Moussa Khouri is a Palestinian. He has described this treatment in captivity, things like having a bag put over your head, bound in an uncomfortable position for long periods of time.
My hands behind my back to the chair. The chair is a small chair.
The standard forms of torture and abuse were sensory deprivations, placing people in abusive body positions, tied up to a small chair with a hood over their head.
The small back of the chair, the back of the prisoner. If you slip down, you'll hang on your hands.
Extremes of heat and cold for days and sometimes weeks at a time. And then this forceful shaking, grabbing people by the shoulders and shaking them violently, which is sort of a concussion effect in detainees.
When the situation was very dangerous, permits were given much faster. Immediate response to save lives.
Why stop at the perpetrator himself? Why can't you then torture the victim's family, their relatives, their neighbors? I mean, if, again, the ends justify the means, then where would you draw the line?
Whenever you put one group of people in a position of total power and authority over another group of people, there is a natural tendency to abuse that power. And that, in fact, is what happened in Israel to the extent that they rescinded the guidelines and they went back to a complete ban on the use of any kind of coercion. You don't allow it because there's no way to control it.
Yet even civil rights activists are conflicted by the modern terror threat.
What would have happened if you could have stopped 9/11? Is there someone you could have interrogated that could have stopped 9/11?
It becomes a much more complicated moral problem.
I mean, it is a thankless job to be an interrogator. You put them in a difficult position that they have to make these moral judgments.
September 11, 2001. America will awaken to find itself confronting a new enemy on its own soil.
People's lives depend on the information that you're extracting from potentially very bad people.
Behind the
October 2001, Afghanistan. With the smoke still clearing at ground zero, America targets the Taliban regime and begins plucking bin Laden's al-Qaeda soldiers off the battlefield.
Prisoners who are captured by U.S. forces or other allied forces, where their first encounters are going to be with U.S. Army interrogators.
I was deployed to Afghanistan in December 2001, and while I was there, I served as an interrogator and then later as the senior interrogator at Bagram Air Base.
U.S. Army interrogator Chris Mackey is one of the first Americans to go face-to-face with the new enemy.
You have special forces units that are going into raids against compounds, scooping maybe a couple dozen of prisoners up and bringing them back via helicopter to a base like Bagram.
The Northern Alliance captured me and handed me over to the American forces.
First they tied our hands, then they blindfolded us and put us in a helicopter and flew us to Bagram.
Those prisoners are taken off those helicopters. They're wearing hoods, they're wearing handcuffs, they're shuffled along, brought down to a prison facility.
Prisoners would be brought into an in-processing center and sort of made to kneel on the ground with their hands behind their heads.
The Americans searched us and took all of my belongings and legal documents, such as my municipality papers and taxi licenses, which I had in my pocket from Kabul.
They're fingerprinted and photographed. Then they undergo a medical examination. It's a very intimidating environment.
They were very rigid, rough, and serious with me.
With some frequency, prisoners would relieve themselves when they were being processed. I mean, it was a terrifying thing. There were a lot of people with weapons sort of staring at them, and it's designed to increase a person's anxiety.
The interrogation begins while the prisoner is still in a heightened state of nervousness. But in the confines of the interrogation tent, the captive isn't the only one feeling the pressure.
I had no experience before I went to Afghanistan in interrogating live prisoners of war. I had never faced a real prisoner before.
For many of the interrogators in Afghanistan, that war was the first time they'd ever encountered a real prisoner. And in the early going, they could be just as unnerved by the experience as the prisoners were. I mean, you could see how it could be a daunting thing to settle into a chair across a table from a prisoner who has a real hardened hatred for you and everything you stand for.
They were not nervous. They were very calm and collected.
It's up to them to get information that a lot is riding on. I mean, lives depend on what these interrogators achieve when they go into the booth.
There's a tremendous three-dimensional game of chess that's occurring between somebody who's trying to resist an interrogation and someone who's trying to gain information.
They told me if I told the truth, then I could go home.
Most prisoners are going to give away the keys to unlock their cooperation, whether those are physical signs, watching body movements, or whether those signs are verbally articulated.
I told them I was working as a baker for the Taliban, and they were paying me.
Some of the giveaways are obvious.
As I was waiting outside, I watched the interrogator question a prisoner. When he was finished, I said, "How did it go?" And he said, "Oh, he doesn't know anything." And I said, "Do you think that he was lying?" And he said, I don't know. I don't think so. And I walked him back into the tent, and I showed him where the prisoner had dug 2 grooves into the ground with his feet as he was being questioned. And I said, I think that he's quite literally dug himself a hole here.
As the war continues, Al-Qaeda forces grow more resistant to interrogation tactics. A Special Forces raid turns up evidence of the terrorists' sophistication.
One of the biggest discoveries was a manual. It has an Al-Qaeda insignia on it. It says interrogation.
And that training manual had information about a variety of different fighting techniques, but part of it was dedicated towards educating volunteers to resisting interrogation techniques, both in the U.S. and from other countries. And it described in great detail all the different types of torture that they might potentially encounter in their own countries. And then it had a discourse about what to expect if they fell into American hands.
And the basic guidance was this, that you don't have much to fear in terms of your personal safety in American custody.
And they knew what types of techniques would be practiced against them, and they also knew how to resist it, how to most effectively stonewall Army interrogators.
It was very condescending in tone toward the Americans. These guys don't use brutal interrogation methods because they're not warriors. And in fact, the best thing you can do is try to provoke some sort of physical confrontation with U.S. interrogators, because if you've got bruises or something, you can show Red Cross inspectors the next time they come through. That's your best chance of stirring up some sort of international outcry.
The Al-Qaeda manual is correct in at least one respect.
The Geneva Conventions are the Bible for interrogators. The bottom line is you're never allowed to hurt a prisoner, never allowed to have physical contact with a prisoner as part of an interrogation. You can't humiliate prisoners for information. You can't use cruel treatment.
To abide by the Geneva Conventions and still get useful information, Army interrogators get creative.
There is a lot of gray area in the Geneva Conventions, and if you read the Army Interrogation Manual, which tries to interpret those documents, they will say you can't touch prisoners, you can't use physical force, you can't make direct threats, you can't threaten their life, but you can play lots of mind games with prisoners. That's permitted.
As the war continues, the Army develops a series of complex ruses, and one that is particularly effective with a high-value capture.
A prisoner who was fairly high-ranking in Al-Qaeda, who had contact with bin Laden and Zawahiri and others. One of the things the Army did was they were letting him see edited versions of news magazines. This was a perk that he was getting to try to make him think he was a special prisoner. And they would slip other stories into this stack of clips that he would get. One time, one of the stories was that the U.S. had convened special terrorism courts and was executing senior Al-Qaeda figures at Leavenworth. And this prisoner read this story, saw names that he recognized, immediately thought that this might be his own fate, and turned and vomited on the floor of the interrogation booth.
The Army also circumvents the conventions by exploiting a basic human need.
We realized that a lot of the best information that we were getting from interrogations was coming at the end of lengthy interrogations. There's a sense of fatigue that sets in. It's just constantly being questioned. And eventually his story, however complex it is and however well it's glued together in his mind, starts to fall apart under constant scrutiny. We realized if we could keep prisoners up for a long period of time, that this would probably be very beneficial to our cause.
And they called it monstering, which was as sinister a name as they could come up with. What it really meant was just sleep deprivation.
So we thought this was a very clever way of achieving our ends with still staying within the boundaries of the Geneva Conventions.
And the rules that they used were that a prisoner could be kept up for as long as his interrogator could go. You couldn't swap out interrogators, you couldn't tag team, but you could keep questioning a prisoner for as long as you could stay up.
One time we did this against a prisoner who had come in after his compound had been raided and a poison had been found there.
Two suspicious kind of vats. They brought these prisoners back to Bagram.
And we decided that this would be a good candidate to practice this long-term interrogation technique on.
And question the prisoner for, I think, 36 straight hours.
It was just a battle between these two people to see who could stay up longer. At about the 23-hour mark, the interrogator came out and said to me, I think we're getting somewhere, but the problem is, he says he sees lobsters on the wall. And I said, that's incredible. He must really be fatigued. He said, yeah, the problem is I see him too.
Finally, this prisoner yields and says his stuff was ricin, which is a poison that is fairly easy to brew and fairly devastating.
We asked him sometime after that, why did you cooperate? And the prisoner said, when I realized that this was the worst that you were going to do to me, I realized that I was probably on the wrong side.
Eventually, interrogators learned to play on one of the prisoners' deepest fears, making them think they could be sent back home, to nations whose system of justice and punishment they know quite well.
We came up with this idea to terrify the Arab prisoners by saying that we were going to turn them all over to his notional home country.
An elaborately staged event on the prison floor that was designed to make the prisoners fear that they were all going to be transferred. There was a U.S. Army interrogator who could pass himself off as an Egyptian, and he spoke flawless Arabic with an Egyptian dialect and looked the part.
We had very carefully planted the ideas for about a week before into targeted prisoners' minds that there was someone coming and that the situation was going to gravely change soon.
And they start summoning prisoners one by one in front of this colonel, and they put a strip of duct tape across their chest.
We wrote the name of the country that we were notionally going to send them to, and they were absolutely terrified. The prisoners were absolutely terrified that we had done this.
And they were sent back into the cages for the rest of the night. And that night, many of these prisoners started coming to the edges of the cages, leaning through the wires, pretending that they had stomach ailments or some other problem.
It started with one person, then another, and then pretty soon the MPs told us that there was an epidemic going on down there. And of course, all the prisoners who had masking tape across their chests that said that they were going to go to some Gulf state country went upstairs, spoke to interrogators, told us everything that they possibly could to try to short-circuit their repatriation home.
There never really was a plane that was going to be taking any prisoners to Egypt. There was a plane. It was leaving the next day for Guantanamo, and these prisoners were on it. But it wasn't until they hit the ground in Cuba that they realized they'd been had.
I told the truth. Even then, they took me to Guantanamo jail.
The specially constructed prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, will be the primary holding facility for enemy combatants seized in Afghanistan. Details about what actually goes on behind the barbed wire are sketchy, but prisoners on their way to Gitmo fear the worst. Channel. Winter 2001. With Osama bin Laden thought to be hiding just out of reach of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, American interrogators race to extract information about his whereabouts from al-Qaeda fighters captured on the battlefield. Each of these men has been removed to Camp X-Ray in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for extensive interrogation.
Every foreign fighter who was in Afghanistan was sent back. Members of the Taliban regime, people who had direct knowledge of threats against the U.S. forces.
They came in with black hoods, handcuffs, and shackles. They put numbers on our bodies, like car license plates. Then they blindfolded us, tied our hands and feet.
They put us on a plane at night. The next evening, we got to the place.
When prisoners were brought back to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the facilities were, sort of much more institutionalized.
An interrogation facility, one that's properly run, is incredibly organized, incredibly orderly. You want to have absolute control.
They were scaring us with dogs. The dogs were barking at us and scratching and attacking with their paws at the cell bars.
At night when we slept, our heads, our hands, and our feet were not supposed to be covered with our sheets. They always kicked the cell bars at night so that we were not able to sleep. They did this so that they could confuse and frustrate us during the interrogations.
In Guantanamo Bay, there were so many interrogations that I don't even remember. I was there 17 months, so I was probably interrogated 20 times or more.
A lot of people have the misconception that Guantanamo was some sort of concentration camp where any type of interrogation could be practiced and that you could be much harder on prisoners. In fact, Guantanamo had very strict rules, much more strict than we had.
Down at Guantanamo, fellows who are doing interrogations for our government are following some pretty rigid guidelines. They know that the media is watching them. They know that the Red Cross and other international agencies are out there watching. They don't want to see people being released with a lot of horror stories.
The sleeping conditions were much better. After the first year, the food quality improved. The soldiers were joking with us, which was not the case at Bagram.
Despite the controlled conditions, experts doubt the value of information coming out of Camp X-Ray.
I don't know who they have down there. They probably have one or two that could provide some real good critical information. Not all of them, certainly.
Many of the prisoners housed at X-Ray seem to be mere foot soldiers with little valuable information about Al-Qaeda's leadership or its structure.
I think it was incumbent upon the authorities, when they arrested all these people, to, as quickly as possible, determine who was a valuable source and who wasn't. And I suspect that they actually had a very small number of valuable sources of information.
There was a great reluctance to release anybody that they captured. Nobody wanted to be the one who signed off the papers that let go somebody who later turned out to be the 20th hijacker.
Well, I see Camp X-Ray as a holding pen for warriors of jihad. The people who, if you let them go, you have to assume they're going to rush out and join some organization and blow themselves up at some point. So in that sense, I understand our reluctance to let these people go. But on the other hand, I don't think that they're very valuable in the war on terror.
The long-term warehousing of prisoners may be keeping jihadists off the battlefield, or it may be creating more enemies.
Twice I tried to commit suicide with a broken piece of mirror and was hospitalized for my attempted suicide.
America's holding facilities in Cuba are criticized by human rights groups and the world press. But the outcry will soon be overshadowed by far darker revelations from Iraq. The twisting road to Abu Ghraib prison begins in Afghanistan, where interrogators feel pressure to use increasingly controversial techniques.
When I was in Afghanistan, it was suggested to us by fairly senior soldiers that we ought to use dogs, that Arabs are terrified of dogs. And we argued about it, and it was by no means a unanimous decision, but we decided that we couldn't do this. We decided that it was wrong.
Over the course of the war, they increasingly embraced harsher interrogation methods. Not necessarily torture, but methods involving greater pressure.
If you're not worried about compromising your own moral fiber, then I suppose you could be a very effective interrogator, because the lesson from Afghanistan for me was the harder that you are, and if you're willing to entertain the possibility of physical coercion, you're probably going to get more information faster.
The harsher the methods they employed, the better the information they got, and the quicker they got it. I'm not sure that the adage in the interrogation business that torture doesn't work is true.
When I first arrived in Afghanistan, I would never have countenanced some of the things that I was accepting by the time I left Afghanistan.
We trace an arc. When the interrogators first arrived in Afghanistan, they were playing by fairly strict rules. No stress positions, no sleep deprivation. By the end of the war, they'd relaxed those rules, and they were using both of those methods, or at least versions of them.
Where my unit left off in Afghanistan, a new unit, the replacements, came in and used that as their starting point.
The unit that replaced those was the 519th from Fort Bragg.
And so by the time they left Afghanistan, they had taken things further still. And then, when that unit redeployed to Iraq, they used their cumulative knowledge as the foundation for how they were going to conduct operations in this new theater of war.
They started there, and they continued to escalate. And they ended up being the unit that was then sent on to Abu Ghraib. And they were in charge of that facility when these abuses occurred.
April 2004. The images from Abu Ghraib hit the world like a sledgehammer.
Well, I think that since 9/11, the Bush administration has, without formally doing so, loosened the restrictions on dealing with people in captivity. And what it leads to is abuses. It leads to the widespread use of coercion and torture in cases where it's not at all appropriate.
It's pretty clear that there were instances in Iraq and Afghanistan where things were done that shouldn't have been. I don't think any of those are traceable to true professional interrogators. They're traceable to people with minimal experience who are operating on emotions and who did things which are outside the bounds of what a professional would do.
There is a natural tendency toward sadism in any kind of prison system.
You had young kids who had no business being in there, who were flipping burgers, 2 weeks before they came out to Iraq.
I don't believe that the prison guards who tormented those prisoners were doing so as part of any kind of intelligence gathering operation at all. I think that they were guards whose natural impulse to sadism was set loose by the atmosphere within that prison.
This was not a pyramid full of high-value targets that they were somehow softening up for an interrogation.
I don't think interrogation had a lot to do with those sessions, but it's clear now that the interrogators had crossed the line somewhere between where they started in Afghanistan and where they ended up at Abu Ghraib. It was all on the same trajectory, increasingly harsh methods, increasingly sadistic treatment.
You had your everyday prison guards who were exposed to the techniques that were being used by military intelligence people and were influenced to the extent that they felt a license to abuse prisoners and to celebrate their abuse of prisoners by taking pictures.
You sort of wonder where that trend line would have ended if the Abu Ghraib scandal hadn't broken.
And the responsibility for the atmosphere in that prison falls upon the military chain of command and on the Bush administration.
The goal of interrogation is to reduce the number of enemies that we have out there. And if other nations see us using those brutal methods, you're increasing the number of enemies we have out there. Abu Ghraib is going to be a recruiting poster for Al-Qaeda for generations to come.
Amid evidence of a thriving black market for nuclear arms components, intelligence experts expect America's new enemies will soon make themselves heard.
Do you have an address?
The U.S. intelligence community faces up to its worst fears, an even more devastating attack on American civilians.
At some point, we're going to catch somebody here in the United States who is on the periphery of what we believe to be a weapons of mass destruction incident. Our government has a responsibility to all of us to get information out of somebody in order to preclude such an attack.
Probably the single most important weapon in the war on terror is information, is intelligence, because the method of operation for these terrorists is not direct.
Interrogation is crucial to the war on terrorism. Satellites and eavesdropping, electronic dishes are useful to an extent, but they're not going to get you inside the intentions of an organization like Al-Qaeda.
The war on terror may pressure interrogators to use more aggressive methods.
If you're willing to throw out the Geneva Conventions, you may lose your moral high ground, but you're probably going to get a lot of information. It's just how far are you willing to go?
A fierce debate rages over where to draw the line, and even what defines words like coercion or torture.
You got to take the gloves off our people. Am I advocating torture? Of course not. But coercion is not necessarily torture. We're putting our own people up on trial for doing basically fraternity pranks. You can call it torture, but there are differences.
It's a judgment call. On the one extreme, you have obvious torture, physically maimed and tortured. On the other extreme, you have something as relatively benign as keeping somebody awake for a long period of time.
Sleep deprivation, you know, roughing a person up, throwing them into a wall. This is not torture. Torture is peeling skin, cutting throats, pulling eyes, teeth, nails. And our enemy does that. We don't do that. And you don't need to do that. But you also can't sit there like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and welcome them to the Magic Kingdom like we're doing now. It's ridiculous.
I think almost any sensible person can see that keeping someone awake is not equivalent to cutting out their eyes. But it is a continuum, and there isn't any way that you can clearly delineate one from the other.
It's a dirty game, and it's going to get dirtier, and Americans are going to die because we're not playing hardball yet.
With a high-value target in the interrogation chair, America may one day face a dilemma that threatens not only the lives of its citizens, but the very foundations of its morals and principles.
The minute you walk in, the clock's ticking.
Is there an attack imminent? This man is a player in it, and you believe he has information. Now we're talking a different level.
How much is too much?
How far is he willing to go in order to get that information?
The question of how far to go is the most difficult question that hangs over this war on terrorism. If you're going to hold on to higher ethics, which may be the right thing to do, there's a cost for that.
Are American lives at stake? Well, now we upped the ante a little bit, haven't we?
The decision of how far to go may ultimately rest on the conscience of the individual interrogator.
In a scenario where you've got an individual who you have reason to believe is time-sensitive information about an impending attack that could take the lives of a lot of people, I would argue that you can set aside certain concerns in order to get that information out of that individual.
If we had a prisoner like that, and we didn't get information out of him, and that day or the next day or a few days later, there was a major incident that killed tens, hundreds, thousands of people in the United States, everybody's going to look and say, why didn't you protect us? Why did you fail?
There really is a consequence for stopping short of using certain methods. I think that's true. I think that mind games and tricks have to be permitted. I do think that physical coercion is not something we want to engage in for a number of reasons. As Americans, we have to stand for something. We have to stand for certain values.
If we fight terrorists by using the terrorists' methods, then what have we achieved?
The solution is that you ban the use of any kind of coercion or torture. But in certain circumstances where you have an individual in custody who has information that can save lives, you're faced as the interrogator with a moral dilemma. You can obey the law, and innocent people may die as a result of it. Or you can take upon yourself the responsibility of breaking the law, and thereby exposing yourself to prosecution and punishment for breaking the law.
Then I come and say, these are the facts that I had at my disposal. This is what I believed at the time. This is what I felt necessary to do. I can invoke the defense of necessity, and then the court decides whether or not it's reasonable that I broke the law in order to avert this catastrophe. But it has to be that I broke the law. It can't be that there's some a priori license for me to abuse people for the sake of averting catastrophes.
You have to accept the consequences of your actions. If you're going to break your compact with the Army and with the American people, you better have a good reason to do it.
It's important to place that responsibility on the shoulders of individual interrogators. If they choose to break the law and use these coercive techniques, they have to have a damn good reason. And the reason has to be strong enough that they feel they can justify their action in order to prevent themselves losing their careers or being put in prison for breaking the law. I think it's the only way to control it, and I think that it's the appropriate way to deal with the problem.
Whatever the decision of the interrogator, there's a good chance the American public will never know about it.
This war on terror, it's a war of intelligence. I think that's important in the long run for this entire war on terror to become covert, that it take place out of the public eye.
Other times, the American people won't be able to see what we're doing.
The preference in counter-terrorist operations is to be able to operate below the radar screen, so that if you have a success, it doesn't show up.
As we go forward, we're going to get increasingly sophisticated in the ways that we deal with the people that we capture, in terms of manipulating public information about their arrest.
No doubt, disinformation is as valuable as information as long as it's well managed. Any possible thing that we can do to stimulate their ignorance and then act upon it.
Psychological warfare, the impact of information operations is very profound. Bad guys are paying attention to what's happening.
We will control every aspect of a suspect's arrest and interrogation from both the standpoint of how we deal with that person in custody and also what kind of information we make public.
Maybe it is to your advantage to release certain bits of information. I mean, you can introduce an event, a scenario that you create.
Inevitably. To the extent that it might be wise to publicize the arrest of someone who hasn't been arrested. In other words, manipulate the playing field a little bit.
There are no rules in a terrorist war. What idiot even came up with rules? We got rules? We're fighting a war with rules? Oxymoron.
This is fundamentally a completely different battlefield than population is used to.
Winning the war on terror means interrogation, the capture process. That's the way we're going to win this war. We're not going to win it on a battleground like Iraq. We're going to win it in a whole bunch of other scenarios around the world.
Now, the American people have to understand this, that if you want answers and you send American officers to get them, well, you might not want to know how they get them, because it's not a clean game. It's a dirty world, and we're fighting terrorists where there are no rules.
I'd say people we have captured or will capture overseas are fearing the worst from us, and that's good.
It's a dirty, dirty business, terrorism, and it's not going to stop until we really show them that it doesn't pay.
It's all well and good to take the high moral ground and refuse to engage in any coercive tactics in questioning someone. But what you're left with is a silent prisoner. You're left with a silent suspect. And we pay for their silence in blood.
On the next episode of The Revolution,